So this is on your integrated communications assignment, December 2019, task 2A. In general terms, this is about building and communicating your value proposition. Now, as marketers, you know, if you do not have a value proposition, how much you communicate, it's going to be a struggle for you. You might be a supermarket brand like Cargill's, Kiehl's, or in the recent past Spa, even Laughs. Or you might be a politician right now looking for your vote. It could be Sajid or Gotabaya or could be Prohan Palavat. What's your value proposition? In other words, what's your differentiation? What makes you special? But having something special or differentiable is not enough if you do not communicate. So let's take, for an example, Kiehl's is building their value proposition through their product and process. They are talking about fresh. Now, what they're doing is they're trying to get fresh vegetables and fruits from the farmer in 24 hours to the supermarket. And that's their value proposition. They're just not giving vegetables, but they're going to give fresh vegetables. And then they are taking that value proposition and they're using their in-store communications, their billboards, their signages, as well as their social media, and they're communicating that fresh aspects of their value proposition to their customers. Compared to that, Cargill's, from the tagline alone, talks about Gedara Gamang, on your way home. So in other words, they are trying to communicate their value proposition of being convenient. In other words, they are located at the roadside, which is generally convenient to get off on your way home. By the way, it's a bit of an old story and it's getting a little boring and looks like Cargill's is losing in their communication of the value proposition. Where somebody like Kiehl's is talking about fresh, whereas Cargill's is still talking about convenience. So this is what this task is all about. So what you're required to do is select your direct competitor. So go to your company background. First of all, see that you talked about your competitor a little bit extra there. Pick that competitor and then start comparing you versus your competitor's value proposition and how it's communicated. So to do that, you could start the task by talking about the importance of having a value proposition. Bring your theory, the authors. Talk about companies who's lost, maybe an example, because they lost their value propositions. Example, Kodak. There could be local examples for you to bring to life. The Kiehl's one is a classic one. They're losing their value proposition because somebody else is giving better value. Some of you studied value also understands value is the difference between the benefits you offer versus costs. Whoever gives you better benefits compared to the costs will have a better value. So you could talk a bit about value proposition and then talk about the importance of communicating the value proposition. So that's your task core. So talk about theoretically what authors have spoken about communication. Then clearly you need to evaluate your company versus your competition. Most of you would use a table, look at the right criteria. Examiner has given you a criteria. Examiner has talked about the style of that communication. Let's take a YouTube ad or a YouTube video. What's the style? What's the tone? And what's the content, which includes the message? So you could use them to look at what you are saying versus what your competition is saying. So you can look at a couple of campaigns, compare it. If it's a detailed comparison, take it to an annexure because that's going to be too much. Bring a summary table to the body and talk about, in paragraphs, a couple of those communications that they're doing and see to what extent is your company effectively communicating their value proposition. My view, we've discussed this in class, if you look at the Cargill's, Cargill's is failing to effectively communicate their value proposition of on your way home or Gedare Anagama. You look at their YouTube, you look at their Facebook, look at everything that they're communicating, it looks a little confusing at the moment. So likewise, you could conclude to what extent is your company effectively doing this, and that should be the final conclusion at the end of these tasks. Remember, when you're talking about your company versus your competitor, examples, you should give the sources where you found it from. Maybe a website, maybe a YouTube link, maybe a press ad. Very important. Some of you might even put a screen grab or two just to give it some color and some credibility to your work. So, all the best. This looks an interesting task for you to complete.